1. When Gregor Samsa woke up one morning from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a monstrous vermin. He lay on his armor-like hard back, and if he lifted his head a little, he could see his bulging brown belly, divided by arched stiffeners, at the level of which the bedclothes, ready to slide off completely, could barely hold up. His many legs, pitifully thin compared to his usual size, flickered helplessly before his eyes. "What has happened to me?" he thought. It was not a dream. His room, a real human room, just a little too small, lay quietly between the four familiar walls. Above the table on which an unpacked collection of cloth samples was spread out, Samsa was a traveling salesman, hung the picture that he had recently cut out of an illustrated magazine and placed in a pretty, gilded frame. It depicted a lady, wearing a fur hat and a fur boa, sitting upright and raising a heavy fur muff in which her entire forearm had disappeared, towards the viewer. Gregor then turned his gaze to the window, and the dull weather, you could hear raindrops hitting the window pane, made him quite melancholy. "How about if I sleep a little longer and forget all this nonsense?" he thought, but that was completely impossible, because he was used to sleeping on his right side, but in his current state he couldn't get into that position. No matter how hard he threw himself onto his right side, he always rocked back onto his back. He tried it 100 times, closing his eyes so as not to have to see his thrashing legs, and only stopped when he began to feel a light, dull pain in his side that he had never felt before. "Oh God," he thought, "what a strenuous profession I have chosen." Day in, day out on the road. The business excitement is much greater than the real business at home, and on top of that, I have to deal with the nuisance of traveling, the worries about train connections, the irregular bad food, constantly changing, never lasting, never warm human contact. The devil take it all. He felt a slight itch on the top of his stomach. He slowly moved closer to the bedpost on his back so he could raise his head better. He found the itchy spot, which was covered with lots of little white dots that he couldn't identify, and wanted to touch the spot with one leg, but immediately pulled it back because the touch sent a cold shiver through him. He slid back into his previous position. Getting up early, he thought, makes one completely stupid. Man must have his sleep. Other travelers live like harem women. If, for example, I go back to the inn in the morning to sign over the orders I have received, these gentlemen are only sitting down to breakfast. I should try that with my boss. I would be thrown out on the spot. Who knows, by the way, whether that wouldn't be very good for me. If I hadn't held back because of my parents, I would have resigned long ago. I would have gone up to the boss and told him my heartfelt opinion. He would have fallen off the desk. It's also a strange way of sitting on the desk and talking down to the employee, who, moreover, has to get very close because of the boss's hard of hearing. Well, I haven't completely given up hope yet. Once I have enough money to pay off my parents' debt to him, it will probably take another 5 or 6 years. I will definitely do it. Then the big deal will be made. For now, though, I have to get up because my train leaves at 5. And he looked over at the alarm clock ticking on the cabinet. Heavenly Father, he thought. It was 6:30 and the hands were moving steadily forward. It was even past. It was already approaching 3/4. Couldn't the alarm have rung? From the bed you could see that it was correctly set for 4 o'clock. It had certainly rung. Yes, but was it possible to sleep through that furniture-shaking ringing? Well, he hadn't slept peacefully, but probably all the more soundly. But what should he do now? The next train left at 7 o'clock. To catch it, he would have had to hurry like crazy, and the collection hadn't been packed yet, and he himself didn't feel particularly fresh or agile. And even if he caught up with the train, a thunderstorm from the boss was inevitable because the clerk had waited for the 5 o'clock train and had long since reported his absence. He was a creature of the boss, without a backbone or sense. What if he called in sick? But that would be extremely embarrassing and suspicious because Gregor had never been sick once during his 5 years of service. The boss would certainly come with the health insurance doctor, reproach the parents for their lazy son, and cut off all objections by pointing out the health insurance doctor, who says that there are only completely healthy but work-shy people, And would he be entirely wrong in this case? Gregor actually felt quite well, apart from a really unnecessary sleepiness after the long sleep, and was even particularly hungry. As he thought all this over in great haste, unable to decide to get out of bed, the alarm clock had just struck 7:15. There was a cautious knock on the door at the head of his bed. "Gregor," someone called. It was his mother. "It's 7:15. Didn't you want to go away?" The gentle voice. Gregor was startled when he heard his answering voice, which was unmistakably his old one, but which was mixed with an irrepressible, painful squeak, as if from below, which only left the words clear for the first moment, only to destroy them in the aftermath so much that one did not know whether one had heard correctly. Gregor had wanted to answer in detail and explain everything, but in these circumstances he limited himself to saying, Yes, thank you, Mother. I'm already up." Because of the wooden door, the change in Gregor's voice was probably not noticeable outside, because his mother calmed down with this explanation and shuffled away. But the little conversation had made the other family members aware that Gregor was, contrary to expectations, still at home, and his father was already knocking on the side door, weakly but with his fist. "Gregor, he called. "What is it?" And after a while, he warned again in a deeper voice, "Gregor." At the other side door, however, his sister complained quietly, "Gregor, are you not well? Do you need something?" Gregor answered both sides. "I'm finished," and tried to remove all the unusualness from his voice by pronouncing it very carefully and by inserting long pauses between the individual words. His father also returned to his breakfast, but his sister whispered, "Gregor, open up, I implore you." But Gregor had no intention of opening the door, but praised the caution he had learned from traveling, of locking all doors at home during the night. First he wanted to get up quietly and undisturbed, get dressed and, above all, have breakfast, and only then think about what to do next because, he realized, he would not come to any sensible conclusion by thinking in bed. He remembered that he had often felt some kind of slight pain in bed, perhaps caused by lying awkwardly, which turned out to be pure imagination when he got up, and he was curious to see how his current ideas would gradually dissipate. He had no doubt at all that the change in his voice was nothing more than the harbinger of a bad cold, an occupational disease of travelers. Throwing off the blanket was quite simple. He only had to puff himself up a little, and it fell off of its own accord. But it continued to be difficult, especially because he was so incredibly broad. He would have needed arms and hands to get up. Instead, he only had his many little legs, which were constantly moving in all sorts of different ways, and which he could not control. If he tried to bend one of them, it would straighten out first, and if he finally managed to do what he wanted with that leg, all the others, as if released, were working in extreme, painful excitement. "Just don't waste time in bed," Gregor said to himself. First he wanted to get the lower part of his body out of bed, but this lower part, which he hadn't seen yet and couldn't really imagine, proved to be too difficult to move. It was so slow, and when he finally, almost wild, pushed forward with all his strength, without considering, he had chosen the wrong direction, hit the bottom bedpost violently, and the burning pain he felt taught him that the lower part of his body was perhaps the most sensitive at the moment. He therefore tried to get his upper body out of bed first, and carefully turned his head towards the edge of the bed. This was easy, and despite its width and weight, the mass of his body slowly followed the turn of his head. But when he finally held his head outside the bed in the open air, he became afraid to continue in this way, because if he finally let himself fall like that, a miracle would have to happen if his head was not to be injured, and he could not lose his senses at any cost. He preferred to stay in bed. But when, after the same effort, he lay there again, sighing as before, and again saw his little legs fighting against each other, perhaps even more fiercely, and could find no way of bringing peace and order to this arbitrary behavior, he told himself again that he could not possibly stay in bed, and that the most sensible thing to do was to sacrifice everything if there was even the slightest hope of getting out of bed that way. At the same time, however, He did not forget to remind himself from time to time that calm reflection was much better than desperate resolutions. At such moments he fixed his eyes as sharply as possible on the window. But unfortunately, there was little hope or cheer to be gained from the sight of the morning mist, which even covered the other side of the narrow street. "It's already 7 o'clock, he said to himself, as the alarm clock struck again. "It's already 7 o'clock, and there's still such a mist." And for a while he lay quietly, breathing weakly, as if he were perhaps waiting for the return of real and natural circumstances from the total silence. But then he said to himself, "Before it strikes 6:45, I absolutely must be completely out of bed. Besides, someone from the shop will come by then to ask for me, because the shop opens before 7 o'clock. And he then set about rocking his body out of bed in a completely even manner, along its entire length. If he let himself fall out of bed in this way, his head, which he would have to raise sharply as he fell, would probably remain unharmed. His back seemed hard. Nothing would happen to it if he fell onto the carpet. His greatest concern was the loud noise that would be made, which would probably cause, if not terror, then at least concern behind all the doors. But he had to risk it. When Gregor was already halfway out of bed, the new method was more of a game than an effort. He only had to rock jerkily. It occurred to him how easy everything would be if someone came to help him. 2 strong people, he thought of his father and the maid, would have been completely sufficient. They would only have had to put their arms under his arched back, peel him out of bed, bend down with the load, and then just carefully allow him to swing over onto the floor, where his little legs would hopefully then make sense. Well, quite apart from the fact that the doors were locked, should he really have called for help? Despite all his distress, he couldn't suppress a smile at this thought. He had already reached the point where he could hardly keep his balance if he rocked too hard, and very soon he had to make a final decision, because in 5 minutes it would be 7:15, when the doorbell rang. "That's someone from the shop," he said to himself, and almost froze, while his little legs danced all the more quickly. For a moment everything was quiet. "They're not opening," Gregor said to himself, caught up in some foolish hope. But then, of course, as always, the maid walked firmly to the door and opened it. Gregor only had to hear the visitor's first word of greeting, and he already knew who it was, the chief clerk himself. Why was Gregor condemned to work for a company where the slightest negligence immediately aroused suspicion? Were all the employees scoundrels, one and all? And was there not a single loyal, devoted person among them who, if he had not used even a few hours of the morning for business, would go mad with remorse and be virtually unable to get out of bed? Was it really not enough to have an apprentice ask questions, if such questions were even necessary? Did the chief clerk have to come himself, and thereby show the whole innocent family that the investigation of this suspicious matter could only be entrusted to the chief clerk's mind? And more as a result of the excitement Gregor was thrown into by these considerations than as a result of any correct decision, he swung himself out of bed with all his might. There was a loud bang, but it was not really a crash. The fall was somewhat softened by the carpet, and his back was more elastic than Gregor had thought, which is where the not-so-noticeable dull sound came from. He had just not held his head carefully enough, and hit it. He turned it and rubbed it against the carpet in anger and pain. "Something fell in there," said the manager in the next room on the left. Gregor tried to imagine whether something similar could happen to the manager as it had to him today. One had to admit that it was possible. But as if to give a rude answer to this question, the manager in the next room took a few determined steps and made his patent leather boots creak. From the next room on the right, the nurse whispered to inform Gregor. "Gregor, the manager is here." "I know," Gregor said to himself, but he did not dare raise his voice loud enough for his nurse to hear. "Gregor," said the father from the next room to the left, "the manager has come and is asking why you didn't leave on the early train. We don't know what to say to him. Incidentally, he also wants to speak to you personally. So please open the door. He will be kind enough to excuse the mess in the room." "Good morning, Mr. Samsa," the manager called out in a friendly manner. "He's not feeling well," said the mother to the manager while the father was still talking at the door. "He's not feeling well, believe me, Mr. Manager. How else would Gregor miss a train? The boy has nothing on his mind but business. I'm almost annoyed that he never goes out in the evenings. He's been in town for 8 days now, but he's been at home every evening. He sits at our table and quietly reads the newspaper or studies timetables. It's a real distraction for him when he's busy doing fretsaw work. For example, he carved a small frame over the course of 2 or 3 evenings. You'll be amazed at how pretty it is. It's hanging in the room. You'll see it in a minute before Gregor opens the door. I'm glad you're here, Mr. Chief. We alone wouldn't have been able to get Gregor to open the door. He's so stubborn, and he's definitely not feeling well, even though he denied it this morning." "I'll be right there," said Gregor slowly and deliberately, not moving so as not to lose a word of conversation. "I can't explain it any other way, madam," said the chief. "I hope it's nothing serious. Although on the other hand I must say that we business people, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, very often have to overcome a slight feeling of unease for business reasons." "So the chief can come in to see you now?" asked the impatient father, knocking on the door again. "No," said Gregor. An awkward silence fell in the next room on the left, and in the next room on the right the sister began to sob. Why didn't the sister go to the others? She had only just gotten out of bed and hadn't even started to get dressed. And why was she crying? Because he didn't get up and didn't let the manager in, because he was in danger of losing his job, and because the boss would then come after his parents again with the same old demands. Those were probably unnecessary worries for the time being. Gregor was still here and wasn't even thinking about leaving his family. At the moment he was probably lying there on the carpet, and no one who knew his condition would seriously have asked him to let the manager in. But Gregor couldn't be sent away immediately because of this little rudeness, for which a suitable excuse could easily be found later. And Gregor thought that it would be much more sensible to leave him alone now, rather than disturbing him with crying and talking. But it was precisely the uncertainty that oppressed the others and excused their behavior. "Mr. Samsa," the manager called out in a raised voice, "what's going on? You're barricading yourself in your room, only answering yes and no, causing your parents great unnecessary worry, and, just to mention this in passing, neglecting your business duties in a way that is actually unheard of. I'm speaking here on behalf of your parents and your boss, and I'm asking you in all seriousness for an immediate, clear explanation. I'm astonished. I thought I knew you as a calm, reasonable person, and now you suddenly seem to want to start showing off your strange moods. This morning, the boss suggested to me a possible explanation for your failures. It concerned the debt collection that you had recently been entrusted with, but I practically gave my word of honor that this explanation could not be correct. But now I see your incomprehensible stubbornness, and I have completely lost all desire to do anything for you. And your position is by no means the most stable. I had originally intended to tell you all this in private, but since you are making me waste my time here, I don't know why your parents shouldn't find out too. Your performance recently has been very unsatisfactory. It is not the time of year to do special business, we recognize that, but there is no such thing as a time of year for not doing business, Mr. Samsa. There must not be one. But Mr. Chief Executive Officer, cried Gregor beside himself, forgetting everything else in his excitement, I will open immediately, right now. A slight feeling of indisposition and a dizzy spell prevented me from getting up. I am still lying in bed, but now I am feeling quite refreshed again. I am just getting out of bed. Just a moment's patience. I am not as well as I thought, but I am already well. How can something like this happen to a person like that? I was fine yesterday evening, my parents know. Or rather, I had a slight premonition yesterday evening. It should have been obvious. Why didn't I tell the office? But you always think that you will get over the illness without having to stay at home. Mr. Manager, go easy on my parents. There is no reason for all the reproaches you are making against me now. I have not been told a word about it. Perhaps you have not read the last orders I sent. By the way, I'm still taking the 8 o'clock train. The few hours of rest have strengthened me. "Don't hold up, Mr. Manager. I'll be at work soon myself, and please be so kind as to say that and to recommend myself to the boss." And while Gregor was saying all this hastily and hardly knew what he was saying, he had approached the box slightly, probably as a result of the practice he had already gained in bed, and was now trying to pull himself up against it. He really wanted to open the door, really let himself be seen and speak to the manager. He was eager to find out what the others, who were now so keen on him, would say when they saw him. If they were frightened, then Gregor would no longer have any responsibility and could be calm. But if they accepted everything calmly, then he too would have no reason to get upset, and if he hurried, he could actually be at the station at 8 o'clock. At first he slipped off the smooth box a few times, but finally he gave himself one last push and stood upright. He no longer paid any attention to the pain in his abdomen, however much it burned. He then let himself fall against the back of a nearby chair, holding on to the edges with his little legs. With that, he had gained control of himself and fell silent, because now he could listen to the manager. "Did you understand a single word?" the manager asked his parents. "He isn't making a fool of us, is he?" "For God's sake," his mother cried, already crying. "He may be seriously ill and we are tormenting him." "Greta! Greta!" she then cried. "Mother?" his sister called from the other side. They communicated through Gregor's room. "You must go to the doctor immediately. Gregor is ill. Get the doctor quickly. Did you hear Gregor talking now?" "That was an animal voice," said the manager, noticeably quiet compared to his mother's screams. "Anna, Anna!" called his father through the hall into the kitchen, clapping his hands. "Get a locksmith immediately." And the two girls ran through the hall with their skirts swishing. How had the sister got dressed so quickly? And tore open the door to the apartment. No one heard the door slam. They had probably left it open, as is usual in apartments where a great misfortune has occurred. Gregor had become much calmer, however. No one could understand his words anymore, although they had seemed clear enough to him, clearer than before, perhaps as a result of his ears getting used to them. But at least they now believed that there was something wrong with him, and were ready to help him. The confidence and certainty with which the initial instructions had been given did him good. He felt included in the human circle again and hoped for great and surprising achievements from both the doctor and the locksmith, without actually distinguishing them. In order to be able to make his voice as clear as possible for the crucial discussions that were approaching, he coughed a little, but tried to do so very quietly, since even this noise might sound different from a human cough, which he no longer dared to decide for himself. In the next room, it had become completely quiet. Perhaps his parents were sitting at the table with the manager and whispering. Perhaps everyone was leaning against the door and listening. Gregor slowly pushed himself towards the door with the chair, let go of it, threw himself against the door, held himself upright against it. The pads of his little legs had a little glue on them, and rested there for a moment from the exertion. Then he set about turning the key in the lock with his mouth. Unfortunately, it seemed that he had no real teeth. How was he supposed to hold the key with? But his jaws were very strong. With their help, he actually got the key moving and didn't pay any attention to the fact that he was undoubtedly doing himself some kind of damage, because a brown liquid came out of his mouth, flowed over the key, and dripped onto the floor. "Just listen," said the manager in the next room. "He's turning the key." That was a great encouragement for Gregor, but everyone should have called out to him, including his father and mother. "Come on, Gregor," they should have called out. "Just get closer to the lock." And imagining that everyone was watching his efforts with excitement, he bit into the key with all the strength he could muster, senseless. Depending on how far the key was turning, he danced around the lock. Now he only held himself upright with his mouth, and depending on what he needed, he hung on to the key or pressed it down again with the full weight of his body. The brighter sound of the lock finally snapping back literally woke Gregor up. With a sigh of relief, he said to himself, "So I didn't need the locksmith," and laid his head on the handle to open the door completely. Since he had to open the door in this way, it was actually already quite wide open, and he himself could not yet be seen. He had to turn slowly around one of the doors, and very carefully. if he did not want to fall clumsily onto his back just before entering the room. He was still busy with that difficult movement, and had no time to pay attention to anything else when he heard the chief clerk let out a loud, "Oh!" It sounded like the wind roaring, and now he saw him too, as he, who was closest to the door, pressed his hand against his open mouth, and slowly backed away, as if an invisible, constantly working force were driving him away. The mother, she was standing here despite the presence of the chief clerk with her hair still loose and standing on end from the night, first looked at her father with folded hands, then took 2 steps towards Gregor, and fell down in the middle of her skirts, which spread out around her, her face sunk completely untraceable into her chest. The father clenched his fist with a hostile expression, as if he wanted to push Gregor back into his room, then looked uncertainly around the living room, shaded his eyes with his hands, and cried until his powerful chest shook. Gregor did not enter the room at all, but leaned against the locked door from the inside, so that only half of his body could be seen, and above that his head tilted to the side, with which he peered over at the others. It had become much lighter in the meantime. On the other side of the street there was a clear section of the endless, gray-black house opposite. It was a hospital, with its regular windows breaking through the front. The rain was still falling, but only in large, individual drops that were visible and literally thrown down to the ground one by one. The breakfast dishes were on the table in abundance, because for his father, breakfast was the most important meal of the day, which he would drag on for hours while reading various newspapers. Right on the opposite wall hung a photograph of Gregor from his military days, showing him as a lieutenant, his hand on his sword, smiling carelessly, demanding respect for his bearing and uniform. The door to the anteroom was open, and since the apartment door was also open, you could see the forecourt of the apartment and the beginning of the stairs leading down. "Well," said Gregor, well aware that he was the only one who had kept calm, "I'm going to get dressed right away, pack up the collection and go away. Do you want to let me go away?" "Well, Mr. Chief, you see, I'm not stubborn and I like to work. Traveling is difficult, but I couldn't live without traveling." "Where are you going, Mr. Chief? To the store? Yes? Will you tell me everything truthfully?" One may be unable to work at the moment, but then it is precisely the right time to remember one's previous achievements, and to consider that later, once the obstacle has been removed, one will certainly work even more diligently and concentratedly. I am so indebted to the boss, you know that very well. On the other hand, I am worried about my parents and my sister. I am in a tight spot, but I will work my way out of it. But don't make it more difficult for me than it already is. Take my side in business. People don't like travelers, I know. People think they earn a fortune and lead a good life. There is no particular reason to think this prejudice through more carefully. But you, Mr. Manager, you have a better overview of the situation than the rest of the staff, even in confidence, a better overview than the boss himself, who in his capacity as an entrepreneur can easily be swayed in his judgment to the detriment of an employee. You also know very well that the traveler who is away from work almost the whole year can easily fall victim to gossip, coincidences, and groundless complaints, against which it is quite impossible for him to defend himself, since he usually hears nothing about them, and only when he has finished a journey exhausted does he experience the terrible consequences for himself, the causes of which are no longer clear. Mr. Chief, do not leave without saying a word to me that shows me that you agree with me at least to a small extent. But the chief had already turned away at Gregor's first words, and only looked back at Gregor over his twitching shoulder with pursed lips. And during Gregor's speech, he did not stand still for a moment, but retreated towards the door, without taking his eyes off Gregor, but very gradually, as if there was a secret prohibition against leaving the room. He was already in the anteroom, and after the sudden movement with which he pulled his foot out of the living room for the last time, one would have thought he had just burned the sole of his foot. In the anteroom, however, he stretched his right hand far away from him towards the stairs, as if an almost supernatural salvation were waiting for him there. Gregor realized that he could not let the chief clerk leave in this mood under any circumstances, if his position in the business was not to be put at great risk. His parents did not understand all this very well. Over the years they had become convinced that Gregor was provided for in this business for life, and in addition, they now had so much to do with their current worries that they had lost all foresight. But Gregor had this foresight. The chief clerk had to be held, calmed, convinced, and finally won over. The future of Gregor and his family depended on it. If only his sister had been here. She was clever. She had already cried when Gregor was still lying quietly on his back. And the manager, that lady friend, would certainly have let her guide him. She would have closed the door to the apartment and talked him out of his fear in the hallway. But his sister was not there. Gregor had to act himself. And without thinking that he was not yet aware of his current ability to move, without even thinking that his speech might not have been understood again, indeed probably, he left the door, pushed himself through the opening, wanted to go to the manager, who was already holding on to the railing of the forecourt with both hands in a ridiculous way, but immediately fell down on his many little legs with a little cry, searching for something to hold on to. He had hardly done that when he felt physical well-being for the first time that morning. His little legs had solid ground beneath them. They obeyed him completely, he noticed to his delight. They even strove to carry him wherever he wanted, and he already believed that the final improvement of all suffering was imminent. But at the same moment, as he lay there, rocking with restrained emotion, not far from his mother, directly opposite her, she, who seemed so absorbed in herself, suddenly jumped up, her arms outstretched, her fingers spread, calling out, "Help, for God's sake, help!" Tilted her head, as if she wanted to see Gregor better, but ran senselessly backwards, having forgotten that the table was set behind her. When she reached him, she sat down quickly on him, as if distracted, and did not seem to notice at all that the coffee was pouring out of the overturned large pot onto the carpet next to her. "Mother, mother," said Gregor quietly, looking up at her. The chief clerk had completely slipped out of his mind for a moment, but he could not resist snapping his jaws into the void several times at the sight of the flowing coffee. At this the mother screamed again, fled from the table, and fell into the arms of her father, who was running towards her. But Gregor had no time for his parents now. The chief clerk was already on the stairs. His chin on the banister, he looked back one last time. Gregor took a run to catch up with him as safely as possible. The chief clerk must have suspected something, because he jumped over several steps and disappeared. "Huh!" he shouted, and it echoed through the entire stairwell. Unfortunately, the chief clerk's flight also seemed to completely confuse his father, who had been relatively composed up until then, because instead of running after the chief clerk himself, or at least not hindering Gregor in his pursuit, he grabbed the chief clerk's stick with his right hand, which the latter had left behind on an armchair with his hat and overcoat, fetched a large newspaper from the table with his left hand, and stamping his feet, began to drive Gregor back to his room by waving the stick and newspaper. No plea from Gregor helped, no plea was understood. No matter how humbly he turned his head, his father just stamped his feet harder. Over there, despite the cool weather, his mother had thrown open a window and leaned out, pressing her face into her hands far outside the window. A strong draft arose between the alley and the stairwell. The window curtains flew open, the newspapers on the table rustled, individual sheets of paper blew across the floor. His father pushed relentlessly and hissed like a wild man. But Gregor had no practice at all in walking backwards. He really was going very slowly. If only Gregor had been allowed to turn around, he would have been in his room in a moment, but he was afraid of making his father impatient by turning around so quickly, and at any moment he was in danger of receiving a fatal blow to the back or head from the stick in his father's hand. Finally, Gregor had no other choice, because he realized with horror that he could not even keep his direction when walking backwards. And so, with constant anxious glances at his father, he began to turn around as quickly as possible, but in reality, very slowly. Perhaps his father noticed his good intentions, because he did not disturb him, but even directed the turning movement from a distance with the tip of his stick. If only it had not been for his father's unbearable hissing. Gregor completely lost his head. He had almost turned completely around when, constantly listening for the hissing, he even made a mistake and turned back a little. But when he was finally lucky enough to get his head in front of the door opening, it became clear that his body was too wide to get through without difficulty. Of course, in his current state, it did not even occur to his father to open the other door to create sufficient passage for Gregor. His obsession was simply that Gregor had to get to his room as quickly as possible. He would never have allowed the complicated preparations Gregor needed to make in order to get up and perhaps get through the door that way. Instead, as if there were no obstacle, he urged Gregor forwards, making a lot of noise. Behind Gregor, it no longer sounded like the voice of just one father. Now there was really no fun anymore, and Gregor pushed his way through the door, whatever happened. One side of his body rose. He lay crooked in the doorway. One of his flanks was completely rubbed raw. Ugly marks remained on the white door. Soon he was stuck and could no longer move on his own. The little legs on one side hung trembling in the air. The ones on the other were painfully pressed to the ground. Then his father gave him a strong push from behind, which was now truly liberating, and he flew, bleeding profusely, far into his room. The door was slammed shut with the stick. Then it was finally quiet. 2. It was only at dusk that Gregor awoke from his heavy, fainting sleep. He would certainly have woken up not much later without being disturbed, because he felt sufficiently rested and well rested, but it seemed to him as if a fleeting step and the careful closing of the door leading to the anteroom had woken him. The light from the electric street lamps lay pale here and there on the ceiling and on the higher parts of the furniture, but downstairs it was dark with Gregor. He slowly pushed himself towards the door, still clumsily feeling around with his feelers, which he was only now learning to appreciate, to see what had happened there. His left side seemed to be one long, unpleasantly taut scar, and he had to literally limp on his 2 rows of legs. One leg had been seriously injured during the morning's events. It was almost a miracle that only one had been injured and was dragging along lifelessly. Only when he reached the door did he realize what had actually lured him there. It had been the smell of something edible. There was a bowl filled with sweet milk with small slices of white bread floating in it. He almost laughed with joy, because he was even hungrier than in the morning, and immediately dipped his head into the milk almost up to his eyes. But soon he pulled it back again, disappointed. Not only did he find it difficult to eat because of his delicate left side, and he could only eat when his whole body was working together, panting, but he also didn't like the milk, which was usually his favorite drink, and which his sister had certainly put in for him for that reason, and he almost turned away from the bowl with reluctance and crawled back to the middle of the room. In the living room, as Gregor saw through the crack in the door, the gas had been lit, but while at this time of day his father used to read his afternoon newspaper to his mother and sometimes to his sister in a raised voice, there was not a sound to be heard now. Well, perhaps this reading aloud, which his sister always told him and wrote about, had recently fallen out of practice altogether. But it was also so quiet all around, although the apartment was certainly not empty. What a quiet life the family led, said Gregor to himself, and as he stared into the darkness in front of him, he felt great pride that he had been able to provide such a life for his parents and his sister in such a beautiful apartment. But what if all peace, all prosperity, all contentment were to come to a terrible end? In order not to lose himself in such thoughts, Gregor preferred to get moving and crawl up and down the room. Once during the long evening one side door, and once the other were opened just a crack, and then quickly closed again. Someone probably wanted to come in, but again had too many reservations. Gregor stopped right at the living room door, determined to somehow bring the hesitant visitor in, or at least find out who it was. But now the door was no longer opened, and Gregor waited in vain. In the morning, when the doors were locked, everyone had wanted to come in to see him. Now that he had opened one door and the others had obviously been opened during the day, no one came, and the keys were now also in the outside. It was not until late at night that the light in the living room was turned off, and now it was easy to see that his parents and sister had stayed awake for so long, because you could clearly hear all 3 of them tiptoeing away. Now no one would come in to see Gregor until morning, so he had a long time to think undisturbed about how he should now reorganize his life. But the high, open room in which he was forced to lie flat on the floor frightened him, without him being able to find out the reason, for it was the room he had lived in for 5 years. And with a half-unconscious turn, and not without a slight sense of shame, he hurried under the sofa, where, although his back was a little pressed and he could no longer raise his head, he immediately felt very comfortable, and only regretted that his body was too wide to be completely accommodated under the sofa. He stayed there the whole night, which he spent partly in a half-sleep, from which hunger kept startling him, but partly in worries and vague hopes, all of which led to the conclusion that he must remain quiet for the time being, and, through patience and the greatest consideration for the family, make the inconveniences that he was now forced to cause them, in his present state, bearable. Already early in the morning, it was almost still night. Gregor had the opportunity to test the strength of his just-made resolutions, for his sister, almost fully dressed, opened the door from the anteroom and looked in with anticipation. She didn't find him right away, but when she noticed him under the sofa, God, he had to be somewhere. He couldn't have flown away. She was so frightened that she couldn't control herself and slammed the door shut from the outside. But as if she regretted her behavior, she immediately opened the door again and tiptoed in, as if she were visiting someone seriously ill or even a stranger. Gregor had pushed his head almost to the edge of the sofa and was watching her. Would she notice that he had left the milk out, and not because he was hungry, and would she bring in another dish that would suit him better? Wouldn't she do it herself? He would rather starve than draw her attention to it, although he was really keen to dart out from under the sofa, throw himself at his sister's feet, and ask her for something good to eat. But the sister immediately noticed with surprise that the bowl was still full, with only a little milk spilled all around. She picked it up immediately, not with her bare hands but with a rag, and carried it outside. Gregor was extremely curious to see what she would bring as a replacement, and he had all sorts of thoughts about it, but he could never have guessed what the sister was really doing in her kindness. To test his taste, she brought him a whole selection, all spread out on an old newspaper. There was old, half-rotten vegetables, bones from the evening meal surrounded by solidified white sauce, a few raisins and almonds, a cheese that Gregor had declared inedible 2 days ago, a dry loaf of bread, a loaf of bread smeared with butter and salt. In addition to all of this, she put the bowl that was probably intended for Gregor, once and for all, into which she had poured water. And out of delicacy, knowing that Gregor would not eat in front of her, she left as quickly as possible, and even turned the key, so that only Gregor would notice that he could make himself as comfortable as he wanted. Gregor's little legs were spinning when it was time to eat. His wounds must have healed completely by now. He no longer felt any hindrance. He was amazed by this, and thought about how more than a month ago he had cut his finger a little with a knife, and how the wound had hurt him enough the day before yesterday. Should I be less sensitive now? He thought, and was already sucking greedily on the cheese, which he had immediately and emphatically been drawn to above all other foods. In quick succession, and with eyes watering with satisfaction, he ate the cheese, the vegetables, and the sauce. He did not like the fresh food, however. He could not even stand the smell of it, and even dragged the things he wanted to eat a little further away. He had long since finished everything, and was now lying lazily in the same place when the nurse slowly turned the key as a signal that he should withdraw. This immediately startled him, although he was almost asleep, and he hurried back under the sofa. But it cost him great self-control to stay under the sofa even for the short time that the nurse was in the room, because the abundance of food had made his body a little rounded, and he could hardly breathe in the cramped space. With little fits of suffocation, he watched with slightly bulging eyes as the unsuspecting sister used a broom to sweep up not only the leftovers, but also the food that Gregor had not even touched, as if it were no longer usable, and how she hastily poured everything into a bucket, which she closed with a wooden lid, and then carried everything outside. She had barely turned around when Gregor pulled himself out from under the sofa, and stretched, and puffed himself up. In this way Gregor got his food every day, once in the morning when his parents and the maid were still asleep, and the second time after lunch, because then his parents also slept for a while, and his sister sent the maid off on some errand. Of course they didn't want Gregor to starve either, but perhaps they couldn't bear to hear anything more about his food than through hearsay, or perhaps his sister wanted to spare them what might only be a small amount of grief, because in fact they were suffering enough. Gregor never found out what excuses had been used to get the doctor and the locksmith out of the apartment that first morning, because since he was not understood, no one, including his sister, thought that he could understand the others, and so when his sister was in his room, he had to make do with hearing her sighs and calls to the saints here and there. Only later, when she had gotten a little used to everything, of course there was no way she could have gotten completely used to it, did Gregor sometimes catch a comment that was meant in a friendly way or could be interpreted as such. He enjoyed it today, she said when Gregor had cleaned up his meal, while when the opposite happened, which gradually became more frequent, she would say almost sadly, "Now everything has come to a standstill again." While Gregor could not hear any news directly, he overheard a lot of things from the adjoining rooms, and whenever he heard voices, he ran straight to the door and pressed himself against it with all his body. Especially in the beginning, there was no conversation that did not somehow, even if only secretly, deal with him. For 2 days, at every meal, discussions were heard about how to behave now, but even between meals the same topic was discussed, for there were always at least 2 family members at home, since nobody wanted to stay home alone, and it was impossible to leave the apartment completely. On the very first day, too, the maid, it was not quite clear what and how much she knew about what had happened, had begged her mother on her knees to let her go immediately, and when she took her leave a quarter of an hour later, she thanked her mother for her dismissal in tears, as if it was the greatest favor that had been done her here, and, without being asked to do so, made a terrible oath not to tell anyone the slightest thing. Now the sister had to cook with the mother, but that wasn't much of a hassle, since they hardly ate anything. Again and again Gregor heard one of them asking the other to eat in vain, and getting no other answer than, "Thank you, I've had enough," or something similar. Perhaps nothing was drunk either. Often the sister asked the father if he wanted beer, and she warmly offered to get it herself, and when the father remained silent, she said, to allay any concerns, that she could send the caretaker for it. But then the father finally said a big no, and no more was said about it. Already during the first day the father explained the entire financial situation and prospects to both the mother and the sister. Here and there he got up from the table and fetched some receipt or some book of notes from his small safe, which he had saved from the collapse of his business 5 years ago. You could hear him unlocking the complicated lock and then locking it again, after taking out what he was looking for. These explanations from his father were partly the first pleasant thing Gregor had heard since his imprisonment. He had been of the opinion that his father had not been left with anything from that business deal. At least his father had not told him otherwise, and Gregor had not asked him about it. Gregor's only concern at the time had been to do everything he could to make the family forget, as quickly as possible, the business disaster that had brought everyone into complete hopelessness. And so he had started working with a very special passion, and almost overnight he had gone from being a small clerk to a traveling salesman who naturally had completely different opportunities to earn money, and whose successes at work were immediately converted into cash in the form of commission, which could be put on the table at home for the astonished and happy family. They had been good times, and never again had they been repeated, at least not in such splendor, although Gregor later earned so much money that he was able to cover the whole family's expenses, and did. They had just got used to it, both the family and Gregor. They accepted the money gratefully. He was happy to hand it over. But there was no longer any special warmth. Only his sister remained close to Gregor, and it was his secret plan to send her, who, unlike Gregor, loved music very much and knew how to play the violin touchingly, to the conservatory next year, regardless of the great costs that would entail and which would be recouped in other ways. During Gregor's short stays in the city, the conservatory was often mentioned in conversations with his sister, but always as a beautiful dream that was out of the question, and his parents did not like to hear even these innocent mentions. But Gregor was very determined to think about it, and intended to declare it solemnly on Christmas Eve. Such thoughts, completely useless in his current state, went through his head as he sat there, upright, listening to the door. Sometimes he could no longer listen because of general tiredness and carelessly banged his head against the door, but immediately held it back again, because even the small noise he had made had been heard next door and had silenced everyone. "What is he doing now?" said his father after a while, obviously turning towards the door, and only then did the interrupted conversation gradually resume. Gregor now learned enough, for his father was in the habit of repeating himself in his explanations, partly because he himself had not concerned himself with these things for a long time, and partly because his mother did not understand everything the first time, that despite all the misfortune, there was still a very small fortune from the old days, which the untouched interest had allowed to grow a little in the meantime. In addition, the money that Gregor had brought home every month, he himself had only kept a few guilders for himself, had not been completely used up and had accumulated into a small capital. Gregor, behind his door, nodded eagerly, pleased with this unexpected caution and thrift. In fact, he could have used this surplus money to continue paying off his father's debt to the boss, and the day when he could have gotten rid of this position would have been much closer, but now it was undoubtedly better the way his father had arranged it. But this money was not enough to let the family live off the interest. It was perhaps enough to support the family for 1 or 2 years at most, but that was all. It was therefore just a sum that one could not really touch, and that had to be put aside for emergencies. The money to live on had to be earned. Now his father was a healthy but old man who had not worked for 5 years, and certainly could not be confident of himself. He had put on a lot of weight in these 5 years, which were the first vacation of his laborious and yet unsuccessful life, and had become quite clumsy as a result. And the old mother, who suffered from asthma, and found even a walk around the apartment exhausting, and who spent every other day on the sofa by the open window, having difficulty breathing, was supposed to earn money. And the sister, who was still a child at 17, and who was so worthy of her previous lifestyle, which had consisted of dressing nicely, sleeping late, helping out in the household, taking part in a few modest entertainments, and, above all, playing the violin, was supposed to earn money? When the conversation turned to the need to earn money, Gregor always let go of the door and threw himself onto the cool leather sofa next to the door, because he was all hot with shame and grief. He often lay there all night long, not sleeping for a moment, and just pawing at the leather for hours. Or he did not shy away from the great effort of pushing a chair to the window, then crawling up the windowsill and leaning against the window, braced on the chair, evidently only in some memory of the liberating feeling that looking out of the window had once offered him. For in fact, from day to day, he saw things that were only a little way away, more and more indistinctly. He no longer saw the hospital opposite, whose all too frequent sight he had previously cursed, and if he had not known for sure that he lived in the quiet but entirely urban Charlottenstrasse, he might have thought that from his window he was looking out into a wasteland in which the gray sky and the gray earth were indistinguishably united. The attentive nurse had only seen twice that the chair was by the window, when every time she had tidied the room, she pushed the chair back exactly to the window, and even left the inner window sash open from now on. If only Gregor had been able to speak to his sister and thank her for everything she had to do for him, he would have found her services easier to bear. But as it was, he suffered. His sister tried to cover up the embarrassment of the whole thing as much as possible, and the more time passed, the better she succeeded. But Gregor also saw through everything much more clearly over time. Her entrance was terrible for him. She had hardly entered when, without taking the time to close the door, despite her usual care to spare everyone the sight of Gregor's room, she ran straight to the window and, as if she were almost suffocating, tore it open with hasty hands, and even when it was so cold, she stayed at the window for a while and breathed deeply. With this running and noise she frightened Gregor twice a day. He was trembling under the sofa the whole time, and yet he knew very well that she would have gladly spared him this if it had only been possible for her to stay in a room where Gregor was with the window closed. Once, a month had already passed since Gregor's transformation, and there was no longer any particular reason for his sister to be astonished by Gregor's appearance. She came a little earlier than usual, and found Gregor looking out of the window, motionless, and in a position that was almost frightening. It would not have been unexpected for Gregor if she had not come in, since his position prevented her from opening the window immediately. But not only did she not come in, she even jumped back and closed the door. A stranger might have thought that Gregor had been lying in wait for her and wanted to bite her. Gregor immediately hid under the sofa, of course, but he had to wait until midday before his sister came back, and she seemed much more restless than usual. He realized from this that the sight of him was still unbearable for her, and would continue to be unbearable, and that she would have to really force herself not to run away from the sight of even the small part of his body that protruded from under the sofa. To spare her this sight too, one day he carried the sheet on his back, it took him 4 hours to do this, onto the sofa, and arranged it in such a way that he was now completely hidden, and that his sister could not see him even if she bent down. If she had not thought that this sheet had been necessary, then she could have removed it, because it was clear enough that it could not be part of Gregor's pleasure to shut himself off so completely. But she left the sheet as it was, and Gregor even thought he caught a grateful look when he carefully lifted the sheet a little with his head to see how his sister was reacting to the new arrangement. During the first 2 weeks, his parents could not bring themselves to come in, and he often heard them fully recognizing the work that their sister was doing, whereas before they had often been annoyed with their sister because she had seemed to them to be a somewhat useless girl. Now, however, both father and mother often waited outside Gregor's room while his sister tidied it up, and as soon as she came out, she had to tell him exactly what the room looked like, what Gregor had eaten, how he had behaved this time, and whether there was perhaps a slight improvement. His mother, by the way, wanted to visit Gregor relatively soon, but his father and sister initially held her back with arguments that Gregor listened to very attentively and that he fully approved of. Later, however, they had to hold her back by force, and when she then called out, "Let me go to Gregor, he is my unfortunate son, don't you understand that I have to go to him?" Then Gregor thought that perhaps it would be a good thing if his mother came in, not every day, of course, but perhaps once a week. She understood everything much better than his sister, who, despite all her courage, was only a child, and ultimately had perhaps only taken on such a difficult task out of childish recklessness. Gregor's wish to see his mother was soon fulfilled. During the day, Gregor did not want to show himself at the window out of consideration for his parents, but he could not crawl much on the few square meters of floor either. Lying quietly at night was difficult for him to bear. Eating soon no longer gave him the slightest pleasure, and so, to distract himself, he got into the habit of crawling all over the walls and ceiling. He particularly liked hanging up on the ceiling. It was completely different from lying on the floor. You breathed more freely, a slight vibration went through your body, and in the almost happy distraction in which Gregor found himself up there, it could happen that, to his own surprise, he let go and hit the floor. But now, of course, he had completely different control over his body than before, and did not injure himself even in such a great fall. The nurse immediately noticed the new entertainment Gregor had found for himself. He also left traces of his glue here and there when he crawled, and she took it into her head to enable Gregor to crawl as much as possible and to remove the furniture that prevented him from doing so, especially the chest of drawers and the desk. But now she was not in a position to do this alone. She did not dare to ask her father for help. The maid would certainly not have helped her, for this girl, aged about 16, had waited bravely since the previous cook had been dismissed, but had asked for the privilege of being able to keep the kitchen locked at all times and only having to open it when called. So the sister had no choice but to fetch her mother once in her father's absence. Her mother came over with cries of excited joy, but fell silent at the door to Gregor's room. First, of course, the sister looked to see whether everything in the room was in order. Only then did she let her mother in. Gregor had hastily pulled the sheet even deeper and into more folds, and the whole thing really only looked like a sheet that had been thrown over the sofa by chance. This time, too, Gregor refrained from spying under the sheet. He refrained from seeing his mother this time, and was just glad that she had come after all. "Come on, you can't see it," said the sister, and her mother was obviously leading her by the hand. Gregor now heard the two weak women moving the old, heavy chest from its place, and how his sister kept doing most of the work for herself, ignoring the warnings of his mother, who was afraid that she would overexert herself. It took a very long time. After about a quarter of an hour of work, his mother said that it would be better to leave the chest there, because firstly, it was too heavy. They wouldn't be able to finish before their father arrived, and with the chest in the middle of the room, it would block Gregor's path. And secondly, it was not at all certain that Gregor would be doing himself a favor by removing the furniture. The opposite seemed to be the case for her. The sight of the empty wall was downright oppressive to her heart, and why shouldn't Gregor have this feeling too, since he had long been used to the furniture in his room, and would therefore feel abandoned in the empty room? "And isn't it then," concluded the mother very quietly, almost whispering, as if she wanted to prevent Gregor, whose exact whereabouts she did not know, from even hearing the sound of the voice, for she was convinced that he did not understand the words, "and isn't it as if by removing the furniture we were showing, that we were giving up all hope of improvement and were ruthlessly leaving him to himself? I think it would be best if we tried to keep the room exactly as it was before, so that when Gregor comes back to us, he will find everything unchanged and will be able to forget the intervening time all the more easily." When Gregor heard these words from his mother, he realized that the lack of any direct human contact, combined with the monotonous life in the midst of the family, over the course of these 2 months, must have confused his mind, because he could not otherwise explain how he could seriously have wanted his room to be emptied. Did he really want to have the warm room, comfortably furnished with inherited furniture, turned into a cave in which he would then be able to crawl in all directions undisturbed, but at the same time quickly and completely forget his human past? After all, he was already close to forgetting, and only his mother's voice, which he had not heard for a long time, had shaken him awake. Nothing was to be removed. Everything had to stay. He could not do without the positive effects of the furniture on his condition, and if the furniture prevented him from crawling around senselessly, it was not a disadvantage, but a great advantage. But his sister unfortunately had a different opinion. She had gotten into the habit, not without reason, of acting as a special expert when discussing Gregor's affairs with his parents, and so now, too, her mother's advice was reason enough for her sister to insist on the removal not only of the chest of drawers and the desk, which she had initially thought of alone, but of all the furniture, with the exception of the indispensable sofa. Of course, it was not just childish defiance and the self-confidence that had recently been so unexpected and hard-won that prompted her to make this demand. She had actually observed that Gregor needed a lot of space to crawl around, but, as far as one could see, did not use the furniture in the slightest. But perhaps the dreamy spirit of girls her age, which seeks satisfaction at every opportunity, also played a role, and which now tempted Greta to want to make Gregor's situation even more terrifying, so that she could then do even more for him than she had done up to now. Because no one except Greta would ever dare to enter a room in which Gregor alone dominated the empty walls. And so she did not let her mother dissuade her from her decision, even in this room, who seemed unsure because of her restlessness, soon fell silent and helped her sister as best she could to get the box out. Well, Gregor could still do without the box in an emergency, but the desk had to stay. And the women had hardly left the room with the box, which they were groaning against, when Gregor poked his head out from under the sofa to see how he could intervene carefully and as considerately as possible. Unfortunately, it was his mother who returned first, while Greta was in the next room holding the box and swinging it back and forth on her own, without, of course, moving it. But his mother was not used to seeing Gregor. It could have made her ill, and so Gregor, frightened, ran backwards to the other end of the sofa, but could no longer prevent the sheet at the front from moving a little. That was enough to get his mother's attention. She paused, stood still for a moment, and then went back to Greta. Although Gregor kept telling himself that nothing out of the ordinary was happening, that only a few pieces of furniture were being moved, he soon had to admit that the women walking back and forth, their little calls to him, the scraping of the furniture on the floor, had the effect of a great commotion, fed from all sides, and he had to tell himself, no matter how tightly he pulled his head and legs to himself and pressed his body to the floor, that he would not be able to endure it all for long. They cleared out his room, took everything he loved. They had already carried out the box in which the jigsaw and other tools were kept, now loosened the desk that had already been firmly buried in the ground, at which he had written his homework as a business graduate, as a middle school student, and even as a primary school student. He really had no time left to examine the good intentions of the two women, whose existence he had almost forgotten, for they were already working in silence from exhaustion, and all that could be heard was the heavy tapping of their feet. And so he burst out. The women were leaning on the desk in the next room to catch their breath. He changed direction 4 times. He really didn't know what to save first. Then he saw the picture of the lady dressed in furs hanging conspicuously on the otherwise empty wall. He quickly crawled up and pressed himself against the glass, which held him in place and did his hot belly good. At least this picture, which Gregor was now completely hidden from view, was something no one would take away. He turned his head towards the living room door to watch the women as they returned. They hadn't allowed themselves much rest and were already coming back. Greta had put her arm around her mother and was almost carrying her. "So what shall we do now?" said Greta, and looked around. Then her eyes met Gregor's on the wall. It was probably only because of her mother's presence that she kept her composure, bent her face towards her mother to stop her looking around, and said, albeit trembling and without thinking, "Come on, shouldn't we go back to the living room for a moment?" Greta's intention was clear to Gregor. She wanted to get her mother to safety and then chase him down from the wall. Well, she could at least try. He was sitting on his picture and wouldn't give it up. He would rather jump in Greta's face. But Greta's words had really worried her mother. She stepped to the side, saw the huge brown stain on the flowered wallpaper, and before she actually realized that it was Gregor she was seeing, she cried out in a shrill, hoarse voice, "Oh God, oh God!" and fell over the sofa with her arms outstretched, as if she were giving up everything, and didn't move. "You, Gregor!" cried her sister with a raised fist and a piercing look. They were the first words she had spoken directly to him since the transformation. She ran into the next room to get some essence, with which she could wake his mother from her unconsciousness. Gregor wanted to help too. There was still time to save the picture. But he was stuck to the glass and had to force himself away. He then ran into the next room as if he could give his sister some advice, as he had done before. But then he had to stand idly behind her. While she was rummaging through various bottles, she was startled when she turned around. A bottle fell to the floor and broke. A splinter injured Gregor's face. Some caustic medicine flowed around him. Greta then, without stopping any longer, took as many bottles as she could hold and ran into her mother with them. She slammed the door shut with her foot. Gregor was now shut out from his mother, who was perhaps close to death through his fault. He was not allowed to open the door if he did not want to chase away his sister, who had to stay with her mother. He had nothing to do now but wait, and overwhelmed by self-reproach and worry, he began to crawling over everything, walls, furniture, and ceiling, and finally, in his despair, when the whole room was already spinning around him, he fell in the middle of the big table. A little while passed. Gregor lay there exhausted. It was quiet all around. Perhaps that was a good sign. Then the doorbell rang. The girl was of course locked in her kitchen, and Greta had to go and open it. Her father had come. "What happened?" were his first words. Greta's appearance had probably told him everything. Greta answered in a dull voice, evidently pressing her face against her father's chest. "Mother was unconscious, but she's already better. Gregor has escaped." "I expected it," said his father. "I always told you, but you women don't want to listen." It was clear to Gregor that his father had misinterpreted Greta's all-too-brief message and assumed that Gregor had committed some kind of violent act. Gregor therefore had to try to appease his father now, because he had neither the time nor the opportunity to explain things to him. And so he fled to the door of his room and pressed himself against it, so that his father, when he entered from the anteroom, could see straight away that Gregor had every intention of returning to his room immediately, and that there was no need to drive him back, but that all they had to do was open the door, and he would disappear in a moment. But his father was not in the mood to notice such subtleties. "Ah!" he exclaimed as soon as he entered, in a tone as if he were angry and happy at the same time. Gregor withdrew his head from the door and raised it towards his father. He really had not imagined his father standing there like this. However, in recent times, because of his new kind of crawling around, he had neglected to pay as much attention to what was going on in the rest of the apartment as he had done before, and should have been prepared to find that circumstances had changed. Nevertheless, was this still his father? The same man who had lain wearily buried in bed when Gregor had gone away on a business trip, who had greeted him in his dressing gown in an armchair on the evenings when he returned home, who had not really been able to get up, but had only raised his arms as a sign of joy, and who, on the rare walks they took together on a few Sundays a year and on the most important holidays between Gregor and his mother, who were already walking slowly in and of themselves, always walked a little more slowly, wrapped up in his old coat, with his cane always carefully placed on his shoulders, and, when he wanted to say something, almost always stood still and gathered his companions around him. But now he was quite well dressed in a tight blue uniform with gold buttons, like those worn by bank servants. His strong double chin was visible above the high, stiff collar of his coat. The look in his black eyes was fresh and attentive from under his bushy eyebrows. His white hair, which was usually disheveled, was combed down into a meticulously precise, shining parting. He threw his cap, on which was a gold monogram, probably that of a bank, across the room in an arc towards the sofa, and walked towards Gregor, with the ends of his long uniform coat thrown back and his hands in his pockets, with a grim expression on his face. He probably didn't know what he was planning. After all, he lifted his feet unusually high, and Gregor was amazed at the gigantic size of his boot soles. But he didn't dwell on that. He knew from the first day of his new life that his father only considered the greatest severity appropriate towards him, and so he ran ahead of his father, stopping when his father stopped, and rushing forward again when his father even moved. They made several circuits around the room without anything significant happening, and indeed without the whole thing having the appearance of being pursued because of his slow pace. So Gregor stayed on the floor for the time being, especially since he was afraid that his father might think that running to the walls or ceiling was particularly wicked. But Gregor had to tell himself that he would not be able to keep up this running for long, because while his father took a step, he had to make countless movements. He was already beginning to feel short of breath, just as he had not had completely trustworthy lungs in his earlier days. As he staggered along, gathering all his strength for the run, barely keeping his eyes open, in his stupor, he did not even think of any other way of saving himself than by running, and had almost forgotten that the walls were open to him, although here they were blocked by carefully carved furniture full of spikes and points. Something flew down just next to him, lightly thrown, and rolled in front of him. It was an apple. A second one flew after it immediately. Gregor stopped in shock. It was useless to keep running, because his father had decided to bombard him. He had filled his pockets from the fruit bowl on the sideboard, and now, without aiming carefully, threw apple after apple. These small red apples rolled around on the floor as if electrified and bumped into each other. A weakly thrown apple brushed Gregor's back, but slid off harmlessly. One that flew immediately after it, on the other hand, literally penetrated Gregor's back. Gregor wanted to drag himself on, as if the surprising, unbelievable pain could disappear with a change of location, but he felt as if he were nailed to the ground and stretched, his senses completely confused. Only with his last glance did he see the door to his room being thrown open and his mother rushing out in front of his screaming sister in her shirt, because her sister had undressed her to give her some breathing room in her unconsciousness, how his mother then ran towards his father, and on the way her untied skirts slipped to the floor, one after the other, and how she stumbled over the skirts and reached his father and hugged him in complete union with him. But Gregor's eyesight was already failing, with her hands on the back of his father's head, begging for Gregor's life to be spared. 3. Gregor's serious injury, from which he suffered for over a month, the apple remained in his flesh as a visible souvenir, since no one dared to remove it, seemed to have reminded even his father that, despite his present sad and disgusting appearance, Gregor was a member of the family who should not be treated like an enemy, but towards whom it was the command of family duty to swallow one's revulsion and to tolerate, nothing but to tolerate. And even though Gregor had probably lost mobility forever due to his wound and needed long, long minutes to cross his room like an old invalid, crawling up high was out of the question, he found that this worsening of his condition was compensated for in a way that was completely sufficient in his opinion by the fact that the living room door, which he had been watching closely for an hour or two beforehand, was opened every evening so that, lying in the darkness of his room and invisible from the living room, he could see the whole family at the lighted table and listen to their conversations, with general permission, so to speak, and in a completely different way to how he had been before. Admittedly, these were no longer the lively conversations of the old days that Gregor had always thought of with some longing in the small hotel rooms when he had had to throw himself tiredly into the damp bedclothes. Now it was mostly very quiet. His father fell asleep in his armchair soon after dinner. His mother and sister admonished each other to be quiet. The mother sewed fine linen for a fashion shop, leaning far under the light. The sister, who had taken a job as a saleswoman, learned shorthand and French in the evenings in order to perhaps get a better job later on. Sometimes the father woke up, and as if he didn't even know that he had been sleeping, he said to his mother, "You've been sewing for so long today," and immediately fell asleep again, while his mother and sister smiled wearily at each other. With a kind of obstinacy, the father refused to take off his servant's uniform at home, and while his dressing gown hung uselessly on the coat hook, his father slept in his place fully dressed, as if he were always ready for his service, and was waiting for the voice of his superior here too. As a result, the uniform, which was not new to begin with, lost its cleanliness despite all the care of his mother and sister, and Gregor often spent entire evenings looking at this stained dress, which shone with its always polished gold buttons, in which the old man slept extremely uncomfortably and yet peacefully. As soon as the clock struck 10, the mother tried to wake the father with gentle words, and then persuade him to go to bed, for there was no real sleep here, and the father, who had to start work at 6 o'clock, really needed that. But in the stubbornness that had taken hold of him since he became a servant, he always insisted on staying at the table longer, even though he regularly fell asleep, and then it was only with the greatest effort that he could be persuaded to swap his chair for the bed. No matter how much his mother and sister urged him with little admonitions, for 15 minutes he slowly shook his head, kept his eyes closed, and did not get up. His mother tugged at his sleeve, said flattering words in his ear. His sister left her task to help his mother, but this did not work with his father. He only sank deeper into his chair. Only when the women took him under the armpits did he open his eyes, look alternately at his mother and his sister, and say, "That is a life. That is the peace of my old age." And leaning on the two women, he got up awkwardly, as if he were the greatest burden on himself, let the women lead him to the door, waved them off there, and then went on by himself, while his mother threw down her sewing and his sister her pen in a hurry to run behind his father and help him further. Who in this overworked and overtired family had time to look after Gregor more than was absolutely necessary? The household was increasingly reduced. The maid was finally dismissed. A huge, bony maid with white hair that flowed around her head came in the morning and evening to do the hardest work. His mother took care of everything else in addition to her many sewing tasks. It even happened that various family pieces of jewelry, which his mother and sister had previously worn with great joy at entertainment and celebrations, were sold, as Gregor learned that evening from the general discussion of the prices achieved. The biggest complaint was always that they could not leave this apartment, which was too big for the current circumstances, because it was impossible to imagine how Gregor could be moved. But Gregor realized that it was not just consideration for him that prevented them from moving, because he could have easily been transported in a suitable box with a few air holes. What mainly prevented the family from moving was their complete hopelessness and the thought that they had been struck by a misfortune like no one else in their entire circle of relatives and acquaintances. They fulfilled to the utmost what the world demands of poor people. Their father fetched breakfast for the little bank clerks. Their mother sacrificed herself to do the laundry for strangers. Their sister ran back and forth behind the counter at the customer's command. But the family's strength did not extend any further. And the wound in Gregor's back began to hurt all over again when his mother and sister returned after putting his father to bed, left their work behind, moved closer together, and sat cheek to cheek. When his mother, pointing to Gregor's room, said, "Close the door there, Greta," and when Gregor was in the dark again, while the women next door mixed their tears or even stared tearlessly at the table. Gregor spent the nights and days almost completely without sleep. Sometimes he thought that the next time he opened the door, he would take charge of the family's affairs, just like before. After a long time, the boss and the manager, the clerks and the apprentices, the so slow-witted house servant, 2 or 3 friends from other businesses, a chambermaid from a hotel in the provinces, a dear, fleeting memory, a cashier from a hat shop whom he had seriously but too slowly applied for a job. All of them appeared mixed with strangers or people he had already forgotten, but instead of helping him and his family, they were all inaccessible, and he was glad when they disappeared. But then again, he was in no mood to worry about his family. Only anger at the poor maintenance filled him, and although he could not imagine anything he would have had an appetite for, he still made plans to get into the pantry and take what he was entitled to, even if he was not hungry. Without thinking any more about how she could do Gregor a special favor, the sister would quickly push any food into Gregor's room with her foot before she went to work in the morning and at noon, so that in the evening she could sweep it out with a sweep of the broom, regardless of whether the food had perhaps only been tasted or, the most common case, had been completely untouched. The cleaning of the room, which she now did every evening, could not have been done any faster. Dirt streaks ran along the walls. Here and there were clumps of dust and rubbish. At first, Gregor would stand in such particularly distinctive corners when his sister arrived, in order to reproach her with this position. But he could have stayed there for weeks without his sister improving. She saw the dirt just as he did, but she had decided to leave it. At the same time, with a sensitivity that was completely new to her and that had affected the whole family, she made sure that the cleaning of Gregor's room was left to her. Once his mother had given Gregor's room a thorough cleaning, which she had only managed after using several buckets of water. The excessive moisture also upset Gregor, and he lay sprawled, bitter and motionless on the sofa. But his mother was not without punishment. For no sooner had the sister noticed the change in Gregor's room that evening than she, extremely insulted, ran into the living room, and despite the mother's imploringly raised hands, burst into a fit of tears, which the parents, the father had naturally been startled out of his chair, watched at first in astonishment and helplessness, until they too began to stir. The father on the right reproached the mother for not leaving Gregor's room to the sister to clean. On the left, however, the sister shouted at her that she would never be allowed to clean Gregor's room again, while the mother tried to drag the father, who was so excited that he no longer knew himself, into the bedroom. The sister, shaking with sobs, worked on the table with her little fists, and Gregor hissed loudly in anger that no one had thought of closing the door and sparing him this sight and noise. But even if the sister, exhausted from her work, had grown tired of looking after Gregor, as she had done before, The mother still did not have to step in for her, and Gregor did not have to be neglected. For now, the maid was there. This old widow, who had probably survived the worst in her long life with the help of her strong bones, had no real aversion to Gregor. Without being in any way curious, she had accidentally opened the door to Gregor's room and had stood in amazement with her hands folded in her lap when she saw Gregor, who, completely surprised, began to run back and forth, even though no one was chasing him. Since then, she never failed to open the door a little every morning and evening and peek in at Gregor. At first she called him over, with words that she probably thought were friendly, like, "Come over here, old dung beetle," or "Look at the old dung beetle." Gregor did not answer such calls, but remained motionless in his seat, as if the door had not been opened. If only this maid had been ordered to clean his room every day, instead of letting her uselessly disturb him as she pleased. One early morning, a heavy rain, perhaps a sign of the coming spring, was beating on the window panes. When the maid began her rhetoric again, Gregor was so embittered that he turned towards her, as if to attack, albeit slowly and feebly. But the maid, instead of being afraid, merely lifted up a chair that was near the door, and as she stood there with her mouth wide open, it was clear that she intended not to shut her mouth until the chair in her hand came crashing down on Gregor's back. "So we can't go any further?" she asked when Gregor turned around again and quietly put the chair back in the corner. Gregor hardly ate anything anymore. Only when he happened to pass by the prepared food would he playfully put a bite in his mouth, hold it there for hours, and then usually spit it out again. At first he thought it was the sadness about the state of his room that was keeping him from eating, but he soon reconciled himself to the changes in the room. They had gotten into the habit of putting things that could not be stored anywhere else in this room, and there were now many such things, since one room in the apartment had been rented to 3 lodgers. These serious gentlemen, all 3 had full beards, as Gregor once noticed through a crack in the door, were meticulous about keeping things tidy, not only in their room, but, since they had rented rooms here, in the entire household, especially in the kitchen. They could not stand useless or even dirty stuff. In addition, they had mostly brought their own furniture with them. For this reason, many things had become superfluous. They were not for sale, but did not want to throw them away. All of these went into Gregor's room. The same goes for the ash box and the garbage bin from the kitchen. Anything that was temporarily unusable was simply thrown into Gregor's room by the maid, who was always in a hurry. Fortunately, Gregor usually only saw the object in question and the hand that was holding it. The maid may have intended to fetch the things again when she had time and opportunity, or to throw them all out at once, but in fact they remained where they had been when they were first thrown, unless Gregor wriggled through the junk and set it in motion, at first forced to do so because there was no other place to crawl, but later with increasing pleasure, although after such wanderings, tired and sad to death, he again did not move for hours. As the lodgers sometimes had their evening meal at home in the common living room, the living room door remained closed on some evenings, but Gregor easily refrained from opening the door, as he had already failed to make use of many evenings when it was open, and had instead lain in the darkest corner of his room without the family noticing. But once the maid had left the door to the living room a little open, and it remained open even when the lodgers came in that evening and the light was turned on. They sat down at the table where father, mother, and Gregor had eaten in the past, unfolded their napkins and picked up their knives and forks. The mother immediately appeared in the doorway with a bowl of meat, and just behind her, the sister with a bowl of potatoes piled high. The food was steaming with a lot of smoke. The lodgers bent over the bowls placed in front of them, as if they wanted to check them before eating, and the one sitting in the middle, who seemed to be an authority to the other 2, actually cut up a piece of meat while it was still on the bowl, evidently to check whether it was tender enough and whether it should be sent back to the kitchen. He was satisfied, and the mother and sister, who had been watching with excitement, began to smile with a sigh of relief. The family themselves ate in the kitchen. Nevertheless, before going into the kitchen, the father came into the room and, with a single bow and his cap in his hand, walked around the table. The lodgers all stood up and muttered something into their beards. When they were alone, they ate in almost complete silence. It seemed strange to Gregor that, among all the various noises of the meal, one could always hear their chewing teeth, as if this was to show Gregor that you need teeth to eat, and that even the most beautiful toothless jaws can't do anything. "I'm hungry," Gregor said to himself worriedly, "but not for these things. How these lodgers eat, and I'm dying." On this very evening, Gregor did not remember having heard the violin the whole time. It sounded from the kitchen. The lodgers had already finished their evening meal. The middle one had taken out a newspaper, given the other two a sheet each, and now they were leaning back and reading and smoking. When the violin began to play, they became attentive, stood up and walked on tiptoe to the anteroom door, where they stood huddled together. They must have been heard from the kitchen, because the father called out, "Are the gentlemen perhaps uncomfortable with the playing? It can be stopped immediately." "On the contrary," said the middle gentleman. "Wouldn't the young lady like to come in and play here in our room, where it is much more comfortable and cozy?" "Oh, please," called the father, as if he were the violinist. The gentleman went back into the room and waited. Soon the father came with the music stand, the mother with the music, and the sister with the violin. The sister calmly prepared everything for the game. The parents, who had never rented rooms before and therefore exaggerated their politeness towards the lodgers, did not dare to sit on their own armchairs. The father leaned against the door, his right hand between two buttons of his closed livery coat. The mother, however, was offered an armchair by a gentleman, and leaving the armchair where the gentleman had happened to put it, sat off to one side in a corner. The sister began to play. Father and mother, each from their own side, watched the movements of her hands attentively. Gregor, attracted by the game, had ventured a little further forward and had already put his head in the living room. He was hardly surprised that he had shown so little consideration for the others recently. In the past, this consideration had been his pride, and yet he would have had more reason to hide now, for as a result of the dust that lay everywhere in his room and flew around at the slightest movement, he too was completely covered in dust. He dragged threads, hair, and food remnants around on his back and sides. His indifference to everything was far too great for him to lie on his back and rub himself against the carpet, as he used to do several times a day. And despite this state, he was not afraid to move forward a little on the immaculate floor of the living room. However, no one paid any attention to him. The family was completely absorbed in the violin playing. The lodgers, on the other hand, who had initially positioned themselves far too close behind the sister's music stand, with their hands in their pockets, so that they could all have seen the music, which was sure to disturb the sister, soon retreated to the window with their heads bowed, talking in low voices, where they remained, watched anxiously by their father. It really seemed as if they had been disappointed in their expectation of hearing a beautiful or entertaining violin performance, had had enough of the whole performance, and were only allowing their peace to be disturbed out of politeness. The way in which they all blew the smoke of their cigars from their noses and mouths, in particular, suggested great nervousness. And yet the sister played so beautifully. Her face was tilted to the side, her eyes following the music lines in a searching and sad manner. Gregor crawled a little further forward and held his head close to the floor so that he might be able to meet her gaze. Was he an animal, since music moved him so much? It seemed to him that the way to the unknown nourishment he longed for was being shown to him. He was determined to get to his sister, to tug at her skirt and thereby indicate to her that she should come into his room with her violin, because no one here was as keen on playing as he wanted to be. He did not want to let her leave his room, at least not as long as he lived. His terrifying figure was to be useful to him for the first time. He wanted to be at all the doors of his room at the same time and hiss at the attackers. His sister, however, was to stay with him, not by force, but voluntarily. She was to sit next to him on the sofa, leaning her ear down to him, and he would then confide in her that he had had the firm intention of sending her to the conservatory and that, had not misfortune intervened, he would have told everyone this last Christmas. Christmas was already over, wasn't it? Without worrying about any objections. After this explanation, his sister would burst into tears of emotion, and Gregor would raise himself up to her shoulders and kiss her neck, which she had worn freely without a ribbon or collar since she went to work. "Mr. Samsa," the middleman called to his father, and, without saying another word, pointed with his index finger at Gregor, who was slowly moving forward. The violin fell silent. The middle roommate smiled at his friends, shaking his head, and then looked back at Gregor. The father seemed to think it more necessary to calm the roommates down instead of chasing Gregor away, although they were not at all agitated, and Gregor seemed to entertain them more than the violin playing. He rushed to them and tried to force them into their room with outstretched arms, while at the same time blocking their view of Gregor with his body. They actually became a little angry now. No one knew whether it was because of their father's behavior, or because they were now realizing, without knowing, that they had had a roommate like Gregor. They demanded explanations from their father, raised their arms in turn, tugged restlessly at their beards, and only slowly retreated towards their room. Meanwhile, the sister had overcome the state of being lost after the suddenly interrupted playing. After holding the violin and bow in her hands, which were hanging loosely, for a while, and continuing to look at the music as if she were still playing, she suddenly pulled herself together, laid the instrument on her mother's lap, who was still sitting in her armchair, having difficulty breathing and with her lungs working hard, and ran into the next room, which the lodgers were already approaching more quickly under the father's urging. One could see how the blankets and cushions in the beds flew up and arranged themselves under the sister's practiced hands. Before the gentleman had even reached the room, she had finished making the bed and slipped out. The father seemed so overcome by his own obstinacy that he forgot all the respect he owed his lodgers. He just kept pushing and pushing until the middleman stamped his foot loudly at the door of the room, causing his father to stop. "I hereby declare," he said, raising his hand and looking at his mother and sister, "that in view of the disgusting conditions prevailing in this apartment and family," and here he spat on the floor, "I am giving notice to vacate my room immediately. Of course I will not pay a thing for the days I have lived here, but I will think about whether I will not make some demands against you, believe me, which are very easy to justify." He was silent and looked straight ahead as if he were expecting something. In fact, his two friends immediately joined in with the words, "We are giving notice to vacate immediately, too." Then he grabbed the door handle and slammed the door shut. The father staggered to his chair with groping hands and let himself fall into it. It looked as if he were stretching out for his usual evening nap, but the strong nodding of his head, which seemed to be helpless, showed that he was not asleep at all. Gregor had lain quietly the whole time in the place where his lodgers had caught him. The disappointment at the failure of his plan, but perhaps also the weakness caused by the long hunger, made it impossible for him to move. He feared with a certain certainty that a general collapse would be unleashed on him at any moment, and waited. Not even the violin frightened him, which fell from his mother's lap from under her trembling fingers and emitted a resounding sound. "Dear parents," said the sister, banging her hand on the table as an introduction, "this cannot go on. If you don't understand that, I do. I don't want to say my brother's name in front of this monster, so I'll just say, we must try to get rid of it. We have tried everything humanly possible to look after it and tolerate it. I don't think anyone can blame us in the slightest." "She's 1,000 times right," said the father to himself. The mother, who still couldn't get enough breath, began to cough muffledly into her hand with a mad expression in her eyes. The sister rushed to the mother and held her forehead. The father seemed to have been brought to more definite thoughts by the sister's words, had sat upright, played with his servant's cap between the plates that were still on the table from the lodger's supper, and occasionally looked at the silent Gregor. "We must try to get rid of it," the sister now said exclusively to the father, because the mother heard nothing in her coughing. "It will kill you both. I can see it coming. If you have to work as hard as we all do, you can't put up with this constant torture at home. I can't do it any more either." And she burst into tears so violently that her tears flowed down onto her mother's face, from which she wiped them with mechanical movements of her hand. "Child," said the father compassionately, and with striking understanding, "but what should we do?" The sister just shrugged her shoulders as a sign of the helplessness that had now gripped her while she was crying, in contrast to her previous certainty. "If he understood us," said the father, half-questioningly. The sister shook her hand violently as she wept, to show that that was out of the question. "If he understood us," repeated the father, and by closing his eyes he took in his sister's conviction that this was impossible. Then perhaps an agreement with him would be possible. But like this— "It has to go," cried the sister. "That is the only way, father. You just have to try to get rid of the thought that it is Gregor. The fact that we believed it for so long is our real misfortune. But how can it be Gregor? If it were Gregor, he would have long since realized that people cannot live together with such an animal, and would have left voluntarily. We would then have no brother, but we could live on and honor his memory. But as it is, this animal is following us, driving away the lodgers, obviously wants to take over the whole apartment and make us sleep in the street. Just look, father," she suddenly cried out. "He's starting again." And in a state of terror that Gregor could not understand, the sister even left her mother, practically pushed herself away from her chair, as if she would rather sacrifice her mother than stay near Gregor, and rushed behind her father, who, merely agitated by her behavior, also stood up and half raised his arms in front of her, as if to protect his sister. But Gregor did not even think of trying to frighten anyone, let alone his sister. He had only started to turn around to go back to his room, and that was certainly striking, since due to his suffering, he had to help the difficult turns with his head, which he raised and hit against the floor many times. He paused and looked around. His good intentions seemed to have been recognized. It had only been a momentary shock. Now everyone looked at him silently and sadly. His mother lay in her chair, her legs stretched out and pressed together, her eyes almost closed from exhaustion. Father and sister were sitting next to each other. The sister had her hand around father's neck. "Now I might be allowed to turn around," thought Gregor, and began his work again. He could not suppress the gasp of exertion and had to rest here and there. Apart from that, nobody urged him on. It was all up to him. When he had completed the turn, he immediately started walking straight back. He was amazed at the great distance that separated him from his room, and did not understand how, in his weakness, he had walked the same path a short time ago, almost without noticing it. Always intent on crawling quickly, he hardly paid any attention to the fact that no word or exclamation from his family disturbed him. Only when he was already in the door did he turn his head, not completely, because he felt his neck stiffen, but he still saw that nothing had changed behind him, only his sister had gotten up. His last glance fell on his mother, who had now fallen completely asleep. He had barely entered his room when the door was slammed shut, bolted, and locked. Gregor was so frightened by the sudden noise behind him that his little legs buckled. It was his sister who had rushed in. She had already been standing there upright and waiting. Then she had jumped forward lightly. Gregor had not even heard her coming, and she called out, "Finally!" to his parents as she turned the key in the lock. And now? Gregor asked himself, looking around in the darkness. He soon discovered that he could no longer move at all. He was not surprised at this. Rather, it seemed unnatural to him that he had actually been able to move around with these thin little legs until now. Apart from that, he felt relatively comfortable. He had pain all over his body, but it seemed to him as if it was gradually getting weaker and weaker, and would finally go away completely. He hardly felt the rotten apple in his back, and the inflamed area around it, which was completely covered in soft dust. He thought back to his family with emotion and love. His opinion that he must disappear was perhaps even more decisive than that of his sister. He remained in this state of empty and peaceful contemplation until the tower clock struck 3 in the morning. He was still able to see the general lightning outside the window. Then his head sank completely against his will, and his last breath flowed weakly from his nostrils. When the maid came early in the morning, in her strength and haste, despite being asked to avoid it many times, she slammed all the doors so hard that from the moment she arrived it was impossible to sleep peacefully in the whole apartment. She found nothing unusual about Gregor during her usual short visit. She thought he was lying there so motionless on purpose and was pretending to be offended. She believed he had all sorts of intelligence. Because she happened to be holding the long broom in her hand, she tried to tickle Gregor with it from the door. When that didn't work either, she got angry and poked Gregor a little, and only when she had pushed him from his place without any resistance did she pay attention. When she soon realized the true state of affairs, she opened her eyes wide, whistled to herself, but didn't stay long. Instead, she tore open the bedroom door and called out loudly into the darkness. "Just look at that. It's dead. It's dead. There it lies, completely dead." The Samsa couple sat upright in their bed and had to get over their shock at the maid before they got around to taking in her report. But then Mr. and Mrs. Samsa, each on their own side, got out of bed as quickly as possible. Mr. Samsa threw the blanket over his shoulders. Mrs. Samsa came out in only her nightgown, and so they entered Gregor's room. In the meantime, the door to the living room, where Greta had been sleeping since the lodgers had moved in, had also opened. She was fully dressed, as if she had not slept at all, and her pale face seemed to prove this. "Dead?" said Mrs. Samsa, looking questioningly up at the maid, although she could check everything herself and even recognize it without checking. "I think so," said the maid, and to prove it, pushed Gregor's body a long way to the side with the broom. Mrs. Samsa made a movement as if she wanted to hold the broom back, but did not. "Well," said Mr. Samsa, "now we can thank God." He crossed himself, and the three women followed his example. Greta, who did not take her eyes off the corpse, said, "Just look at how thin he was. He hadn't eaten anything for such a long time. The food came in and went out again as quickly as it came. Gregor's body was actually completely flat and dry, which was only really noticeable now that he was no longer lifted up by his little legs, and there was nothing else to distract the view." "Come in, Greta, for a while," said Mrs. Samsa with a wistful smile, and Greta, not without looking back at the corpse, went into the bedroom behind her parents. The maid closed the door and opened the window completely. Despite the early morning, the fresh air already had a touch of lukewarmness. It was already the end of March. The three lodgers came out of their room and looked around in surprise for their breakfast. They had been forgotten. "Where is breakfast?" the middleman asked the maid grumpily, but the maid put her finger to her mouth and then hastily and silently waved to the men to come into Gregor's room. They came and stood around Gregor's body in the now very bright room, their hands in the pockets of their slightly worn coats. Then the bedroom door opened, and Mr. Samsa appeared in his livery, his wife on one arm and his daughter on the other. Everyone was a little tearful. Greta occasionally pressed her face against her father's arm. "Leave my apartment immediately," said Mr. Samsa, and pointed to the door without letting the women go. "What do you mean?" said the middleman, somewhat dismayed, and smiled sweetly. The other two held their hands behind their backs and rubbed them together constantly, as if in joyful anticipation of a big argument that would surely turn out well for them. "I mean exactly what I say," answered Mr. Samsa, and walked in a line with his two companions towards the lodger. At first the lodger stood still and looked at the floor, as if things were arranging themselves in a new order in his head. "Then let's go," he then said, and looked up at Mr. Samsa, as if, in a sudden sense of humility, he were demanding new permission for this decision. Mr. Samsa simply nodded briefly at him several times with wide eyes. Thereupon the lodger actually walked straight into the anteroom with long strides. His two friends had been listening for a while with very steady hands, and now practically hopped after him, as if afraid that Mr. Samsa might enter the anteroom before them and disrupt their connection with their guide. In the anteroom, all three took their hats from the coat rack, pulled their canes out of the cane holder, bowed silently, and left the apartment. With what turned out to be a completely unfounded suspicion, Mr. Samsa and the two women stepped out onto the forecourt. Leaning on the banister, they watched as the three men descended the long staircase slowly but steadily, disappearing at a certain bend in the staircase on each floor and reappearing after a few moments. The lower they went, the more the Samsa family lost interest in them, and when a butcher's apprentice came up towards them and then high above them with a stretcher on his head, Mr. Samsa and the women soon left the banister, and everyone returned to their apartments, as if relieved. They decided to use the day to rest and go for a walk. They not only deserved this break from work, they absolutely needed it. And so they sat down at the table and wrote 3 letters of apology, Mr. Samsa to his management, Mrs. Samsa to her employer, and Greta to her principal. While they were writing, the maid came in to say that she was leaving because her morning work was over. At first, the 3 writers just nodded without looking up, and only when the maid still refused to leave did they look up angrily. "Well?" asked Mr. Samsa. The maid stood in the doorway smiling, as if she had a great piece of good news to report to the family, but would only do so if she was thoroughly questioned. The almost upright little ostrich feather on her hat, which had annoyed Mr. Samsa throughout her entire time working there, swayed slightly in all directions. "So what do you actually want?" asked Mrs. Samsa, whom the maid had the most respect for. "Yes," answered the maid, unable to continue because of her friendly laughter. "So you don't have to worry about how the stuff from next door is going to be taken away. It's all right." Mrs. Samsa and Greta bent down to their letters as if they wanted to continue writing. Mr. Samsa, who noticed that the maid was about to start describing everything in detail, firmly blocked her with an outstretched hand. But since she was not allowed to tell them, she remembered how much of a hurry she was in, called out, obviously insulted, "Goodbye, everyone," turned around wildly and left the apartment, slamming the door horribly. "She'll be let go in the evening," said Mr. Samsa, but received no answer from either his wife or his daughter, for the maid seemed to have disturbed their barely regained peace. They got up, went to the window and stayed there, holding each other in their arms. Mr. Samsa turned around in his chair towards them and watched them quietly for a while. Then he called out, "So come here. Leave the old things behind, and show a little consideration for me, too." The women followed him immediately, rushed to him, caressed him, and quickly finished their letters. Then all 3 left the apartment together, something they had not done for months, and took the tram outside the city. The car in which they were sitting alone was completely bathed in warm sunshine. Leaning back comfortably in their seats, they discussed the prospects for the future, and on closer inspection it turned out that these were not bad at all, because all 3 of their jobs, although they had not yet asked each other about them, were extremely favorable and particularly promising for later. The greatest immediate improvement in the situation would of course easily come from a change of residence. They now wanted to take a smaller and cheaper apartment, but one in a better location and generally more practical than the current one, which Gregor had chosen. While they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Samsa, looking at their daughter, who was becoming more and more lively, almost simultaneously remembered how she had blossomed into a beautiful and voluptuous girl, in spite of all the troubles that had made her cheeks pale. Growing quieter and communicating almost unconsciously through glances, they thought that it would now be time to look for a good man for her. And it was like confirmation of their new dreams and good intentions when, at the destination of their journey, their daughter was the first to stand up and stretch her young body.